And people all over the earth are having their own experiences, the near-death experiences, as you mentioned. And scientists know that's happening. Doctors know their patients are going through these things.
Yeah.
Yes, I think that we are at a time in which we are beginning to bring together our past and realize our potential at the same time that we've got to do business with what was not brought forth, the darkness that we have allowed to be in the world. But I think we can do it. I think we have that understanding and that potential that's growing.
For thousands of years, we have been living in a spiritual wasteland. We have been metaphysically malnourished. This is especially true for the so-called Western world. Materialistic science and thinking have been in the front seat, so to speak, and knowledge about our inner essence has been stored in the trunk. Perhaps we are entering an era in which we rediscover this essential knowledge about our spiritual connection and merge it with science. Welcome to Mind the Shift. I am Anders Bolling, your host. Today I am very happy to introduce you to Betty Kovacs, who has done extensive studies of the shaman-mystic spiritual tradition of prehistory and how this knowledge has survived all the way to our time, often under the radar, despite harsh suppression from the church and state. Betty Kovacs earned her doctorate from the University of California in comparative literature and theory of symbolic mythic language, and taught these subjects for 25 years. She was for many years chair and program chair of the Carl Gustav Jung Society in Irvine, California. About 30 years ago, dramatic personal experiences changed her life. Within a 3-year period, she experienced the death of her mother, her son, and her husband in separate automobile accidents. And these deaths gave rise to changed states of consciousness, which she has told about in a book, The Miracle of Death, There is Nothing But Life. In her latest book, Merchants of Light, is a magnificent review of the ancient knowledge about life and death, humankind's inner essence, and our connection to the spiritual realm. Welcome to the podcast, Betty.
Thank you so much. Your introduction was perfect about our condition at this time and what is being required of us and possible for us at this time.
Yes, and I hope I got everything right in the resume, so there's...
Perfect.
Your book, Merchants of Light, which I've just read, I will just hold it up for the viewers here. See if you can see it. Yeah, looks like this. It is actually, it's magnificent, and it's packed with wisdom and knowledge, and it's almost difficult to know where to begin, really. But I want to start in that, and I want to start to talk about this book particularly. And I was thinking, looking at the very long line of the shaman-mystic tradition, I don't think there is any other group of people on this earth who represent that better than the San people of Southern Africa. I mean, they are considered to be descendants of the original Homo sapiens, and they're still here.
Yes.
So can you please start telling us about what significance the San people has for this for the spiritual evolution of humankind?
Yes, I think just knowing that they exist was a gift to me. I read Lawrence Vanderpost, who had lived in South Africa and had been around the San people. And then while I was writing about them, they really just gave me joy to write about them, to read about them, to think about them, because they really had achieved a way of living in the world completely in harmony with the rhythms of nature. And they discovered the ability to trigger that valve that kind of limits our consciousness for daily life. They knew how to trigger that so that it would open and they could experience cosmic consciousness or universal mind in which we are all born. We all live in that. But this valve has become so tight that we don't even know the ocean that we live in, the ocean of consciousness. But they learned how to do it so joyfully. And one of the things that I loved is that I actually reading Bradford Keeney, I learned a much deeper insight into this ability of the Sand Bushman through his work and his wife Hillary. But when he told them that there are people on the earth who really work at this and meditate, they sit for hours in meditation, and the Sand looked at them and said, "Oh no, how sad. They were all alone. Well, we would never do it alone." They dance, they touch, they hold, and they experience this as a communal consciousness, which of course it is. And they don't think of it as one person achieving this high. No, we are all in this ocean of cosmic consciousness, the heart of which is love and communication and communion. And that just gave me so much pleasure. But just to know that, and they say they've been around for 65,000 years. Now, archaeologists say 33 years. That's when they see some of the paintings. That would be at the same time that the cave cultures existed and the paintings were being done. Of course, the cave cultures usually thought of as having existed earlier, but it wouldn't be if the Sand are correct. And I rather think they are. But nevertheless, here we have these two cultures, and we don't know as much about the cave cultures as we do the Sand, because there were people who actually talked with shamans from the Sand people, and they talked about the meaning of these, the rock art, and how it was their spiritual journeys, and that they etched in stone their experiences with the other world. So I think to know that these first people knew how to live in harmony with the earth, sustainably, we could say for sure, and they knew how to have joy. And I think that's so important, is that no matter what we go through, if we can see it in the larger dimension, we can have joy. We're going to grieve, but we can also allow that to open up into a joyous world of understanding what we're up to.
Yeah. Do you know if they are still? I mean, they are still here, still around. They live in Namibia and Botswana mainly, I think.
Yes, they do. They do.
Yeah. Are they still practicing these old traditions, these old shaman mystic traditions, in the way that they used to, or has their culture been, in a way, destroyed by modern?
Well, Graham Hancock calls them the murdered culture. They were treated so badly from so many different groups of people. And certainly, I think it was not until the 40s or 30s, I don't remember exactly which, when the government of South Africa no longer sold licenses to go hunt them. I mean, this is how misunderstood they have been. And but yes, the answer to your question is yes, they are still there. Few, very few. I don't know how long they'll be able to survive. And there are the elders who still hold that ancient teaching. And Bradford Keeney and his wife were able, Bradford spent 20 years off and on with them. And he was able to experience all that they experienced, and they trusted him, and they actually gave him their teachings, and it is out now. It's a teachings. I don't remember the exact title, but it would be under Bradford Keeney. They have actually allowed him to put that in English and have it published, because they realize that this is such a crucial time for the earth, that we have so forgotten this ability that they have naturally, and the joy that we can have in the earth. and the creativity. So they wanted to give that, and they have. I don't know how long they can survive because there are very, very few of them. But I'm very grateful to Bradford Keeney that he actually, it's an interesting story because when he was younger, he was playing the piano and so deep into the music that he had a cosmic consciousness experience. And it was so filled with love and joy and light that he didn't know what to do with it. And it lasted all night and into the next day. He simply didn't know what to do with it. And I think he ended up going to MIT in Purdue, but he received his degree and then he was teaching in a university, and he was invited to teach in a university in South Africa. And I think it was about a week before he left, he had a dream, and it was a map, and it showed him exactly where he was to go.
Yeah.
And so when he got there, he got a team together, and he did go. And as he was going across the desert, he saw the San running toward him. And when they got to him, they said, "Oh, welcome. Yeah. We have been waiting for you."
They also had dreamt about him.
Yes, they must have. And I think it's interesting that at this time, when everything is so on the line, that he would have that vision, and then the vision to go meet them, and that he would, and that he actually has saved their teachings for the West. That seems to me a miraculous kind of event.
Yeah. It's a wonderful story. I remember that from the book. Yeah, I was amazed. So, and then they have these ancient cave paintings. You said that they've been there for about 66,000 years. I've read somewhere that they might have been there for 100,000 years, but nobody actually really knows. But the cave paintings are dated like some 35 to 40,000 years back, I think. And they're contemporary with these famous paintings in the caves in Spain and France. Are they depicting more or less the same kind of imagery and representations of the sky and the inner world and all that?
Well, they're mainly etchings on the face of rock, but they're all over Africa. I mean, it's just immense. I mean, they've been around a long time, for sure. But they're more etchings, and the images are different. In the cave cultures, the color and the movement are incredible. But in both cases, they are definitely this expression of spirit, of soul, of inner life, and our connection to that. I mean, that's always so important. It's like the cave wall was thought of not as something solid, but as that membrane that if they could draw the image on it, it could come through to us. So it was always that mediation and participation in the spirit world.
Yeah, and it's just recently that the Western science has recognized that these paintings were actually showing something very deep, and I mean, it was when they first were discovered, I guess they were just dismissed as something very insignificant.
Oh, you know, it's so sad. It really, the cave cultures, the discovery of them, of course, people had discovered and they saw these things. They were phenomenal. But then there was a man who had portable art from Altamura, and he knew that was had to be the same age, the painting, as this portable art, which was, you know, it was identified as being very early. And when he presented that to the Society for Anthropology, he was laughed out of the place, and he was made fun of for years. And the so-called scholars who rejected everything he had to say wouldn't even go look at the cave. It was many years later when people had gone and they realized they couldn't take that position anymore. But this has been something that's sad too, is that universities often are so slow to recognize changes, but nevertheless, it was recognized. And while it was recognized earlier, it was mainly in the 20th century that we really came to realize, wait a minute, this is something really amazing and spiritual. But many of the people who were doing the work in the caves would have nothing to do with the spiritual part of it or the shamanic. And when David Lewis Williams and Jean-Claude actually worked on the shamanic aspects and published a book on that, when they went back to work with their colleagues the next summer, no one would even mention it. You know, it just, they, you know, weren't going to accept it. Or maybe later there was a joke about it. And this is so sad, but nevertheless, now it's pretty much accepted that yes, this is shamanic. This is, and when I went to the caves, when you're in it, you know that, I mean, that labyrinthine journey to get to a place where you can stand up and see these incredible paintings. I mean, it's quite an experience. But yes, it was in the 20th century that it's pretty much accepted now, late 20th century. Yes, this is shamanic. And what helped so much was David Lewis Williams' work with the San people. And he understood shamanism and had done so much to preserve the rock art in South Africa. So he could see the parallels. And so that was a wonderful thing. But now we have these two cultures that radiate our early longing and achievement of communicating with the spirit and living harmoniously in the world. And I think the cave cultures lasted at least 25,000 years peacefully, and the San at least 27,000, maybe much, much longer, So this is our natural response to the world when we're not thwarted and suppressed, I think. I mean, those many, many years. And now other places are being discovered, and that were places of worship and connecting to spirit, to who we are.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, this is the default sense that small children have, of course, when they are very young. I mean, everyone can remember that if one thinks back long enough, far enough. I mean, that life is magical, and that there is purpose and meaning to life, which we are then talked out of when we get a little bit older. We go to school.
That's a good way to put it. Talked out of.
Yes.
As a kid, I just thought, is this it? When I would hear what people had to say.
Yeah.
But I went to the university, and of course, there is the Western worldview that is nothing but matter. Forget this business about spirits nonsense. There's you're a fluke of nature. It's all a fluke of nature, an accident just happened, and there's no meaning, no purpose. And when you're dead, you're dead. I think that is the most dreadful and destructive worldview that any people could have. And I think we're the only ones who had it. Yeah. And no wonder there's such illness today. I think what we're experiencing now, as we're discovering all of these things about our potential, is that we're also going to have to deal with the woundedness and the illnesses and the darkness, we'd have to say, of consciousness that is a result of this narrow, restrictive, incorrect thinking, which quantum physics, thank God, has taught us that is not correct. There are many dimensions of reality.
Exactly. Yes, we will come back to that in a little while. I think we have, as you say, this is a natural way of seeing life and seeing how things work. This shaman mystic tradition tells us what's natural to us, and it's been with us all along, but it's been suppressed and it's been put in the trunk, as I said at the beginning.
I like that, John. So true.
Yeah. Then. What happened? I mean, the San people represent the long line of this tradition from 100,000 years ago until this day. But then along the way, there have been so many cultures and so many things happening, and it's been suppressed. So what happened? If you fast forward a little bit here, the so-called civilization came along, which we call civilization. And I mean, you can have a discussion about what that is, but there was sedentary culture, there were kings, there were pharaohs. There was top-down rule, and the Egyptians, the Greek, Judaism, and Christianity appeared, and the knowledge about our true essence was suppressed. I mean, that's not to say that these people didn't believe in gods and all that, but there was, I mean, this direct connection between a human being and these other realms was not recognized. So tell us what happened in these early sedentary so-called civilizations.
I think what is really important, what you said, is that the connection, the experiential connection, is that later it was a preaching, a teaching, a telling, a believing. And that was not our original way of being in the world. It was, we didn't have to believe anyone because we had needed the experience of it. the experience, gnosis, of which the church so suppressed later, is no experience. But this was the natural, of course. How we're not believing something someone tells us, we have to experience it, and it's a completely different understanding of the world. But after the Upper Paleolithic or the cave cultures in Europe, there was old Europe, which the archaeologist Maria Gimbutas discovered, and she's now being phased out. It's interesting. I read her material when I was working on this years ago, and actually when I was working on my doctorate, and she then became a person on my committee. And of course, some of the others didn't know, who is this, but she worked for years in old Europe, and she said there are probably at least 500,000 artifacts. I mean, that world is, when you work with it, you feel that same kind of joy. And she told me that, she said, I could hold one of those artifacts in my hand and I could feel it. But she said, of course I can't. I can't tell this. And it turns out that this was for several thousand years, but by about 4,000, and she saw the connection to the Upper Paleolithic, but about 4,000 BCE, people began to come from the east. She called them Kurgans, the waves of warrior types, violent, completely different worldview, completely different way of being in the world, of fighting and conquering and so on. And they started coming in waves. And gradually, over 1,000 years, we kind of merged this old European or cave culture, even the connection with this incoming group of people. And they, of course, achieved dominance. And basically, they are the ones who have dominated in culture since. But when she discovered these artifacts, she realized here is a completely different set of symbols. These people lived by different symbolic systems and structures. And the feminine was very, I would say central, I would say, but it wasn't dominant. It wasn't a matriarchy. The male and female, it appears, worked together. But the symbol of a woman was, of course, nature herself, in which every man, woman, and child has that within them. She was heart consciousness. She was life-giving and life-sustaining, and she brought death, but death was never seen without birth. It was the cycle. There was no death without birth. And it was just a wonderful revelation, you might say, to see these artifacts and work with them. But of course, she was denied and ridiculed. But, she read and spoke 24 different languages in that old European area. Wow. I remember she said to me, "Oh, Betty, you know how it is. You learn one of them and all the rest come easily." And I said, that's not my experience at all. But nevertheless, she really did know what she was talking about. She was from Lithuania. She had seen how they had more of that ancient symbolism because the church didn't come there until later. So that existed. And one of the major symbols of that culture was the labyrinth. And that was an incredibly beautiful symbol, and it was part of a ritual. And I think Karl Kerényi, the Hungarian scholar, classical scholar, saw this and understood this so deeply, is that the walking or dancing, even still in Greece, they dance the circular dance of the labyrinth, but without that deep inner experience, I think, and connection. But at any rate, he said, the labyrinth is, you walk it, you circle around and around and down to your deepest self at the center of the labyrinth, which is life-giving. And there you confront the divine, the cosmic mind, not as other, but as self. And this is the secret of it all. Yeah. We are all divine, immortal, and creative. And the labyrinth takes us to the knowledge of who we really are, not to obey or follow, but to become the Christ, to be cosmic consciousness.
Yeah, we have been so conditioned to look for truths and answers outside of us all the
time.
To
follow. And the Roman Church had a lot to do with that, is that they made, that's a bit of a story, but we could
Well, maybe we can go into that. You mentioned Christ, the Christ consciousness. And of course, for a Western person, I think most of the people who are listening to this podcast are placed in the Western world, whatever that is. But anyway, I think most people know what you refer to when you say that. And also Christianity has been dominant for a long time in this in these parts of the world. And so it's very interesting to learn about Jesus and what he actually said and did, and and the fact that what's written in the official Bible may not be exactly what he actually was talking about, because he actually was a representative of this shaman mystic tradition. So tell us about the Nag Hammadi texts and what Jesus really was talking about.
Yes, well, and to do that very quickly, I would go back to the Judaic First Temple tradition, in which they did have the shamanic mystic ritual, and they had what they called a wisdom literature. And here the feminine existed with the masculine. Together, they equally created the world. And so they danced the dance of life together. But by 621 BCE, there was a movement. No one knows who the Deuteronomists were, but they were a group of people who changed everything, and Josiah went along with it. And they destroyed the First Temple tradition, the shaman-mystic tradition, and they destroyed all images of the feminine. There were icons, statues of her destroyed, and the tree was her symbol, because that was a symbol of life and giving the fruit of cosmic consciousness. Just burned them all down. They also got rid of the wisdom literature. Well, many Jews were not happy with this. They took the literature to Egypt. And I think that some who later went to Babylon during the exile must have had it too. Yeah. And I think that tradition continued to live and later emerged in Kabbalah much later. I think those are the roots of it. But then, according to Margaret Barker, who's a wonderful Old Testament scholar, and she's talking about once we found the Dead Sea Scrolls of the Jews, they were Jews who did not go along with the Second Temple. They felt they carried the true covenant of Israel, which was, of course, the shaman mystic tradition. When we found that library, and then right after World War II, and then we found at about the same time, these texts that were buried in Egypt, which were older, but they also were Gnostic. So we could see the Dead Sea Scrolls were Gnostic carrying on of the First Temple tradition. And then here in Christianity were Christians who were trying to hold on to the true shamanic tradition of Jesus. And they buried those texts around 400 AD because they knew they were told they would be burned otherwise. Yeah. And so we found those texts. So we find it different.
Those are the ones that are called the Gnostics.
Yes, they are Gnostics and the Nag Hammadi. So there are many forms of Gnosticism and many ideas associated with it. But Gnosis really is the experiencing of that cosmic mind of which we are all a part. So what we find in the Jesus of the Nag Hammadi text reveals that he is the shaman mystic. And Margaret Barker said that once we got the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Nag Hammadi text, and we had all of the other texts that were not included in the canon decided on during Constantine's time by the church fathers, then she said we can see a much larger picture. And so she said that there were Jews who kept this tradition of the First Temple. They were the Essenes, they were Therapeutae, and they were the early allegorists with Philo-Judaeus. So here all over that area were Jews who separated from the Second Temple and tried to keep this living shaman mystic tradition going. And it looks as though those were the people who began the Jesus tradition, that was actually probably out of the Therapeutae. They were mystics, they were shamans. And even some of the church fathers thought that they might have written the Gospels. But at any rate, here is this Jesus. And we are told that there was a hidden tradition that Jesus taught. And of course, it's the tradition of going inward and experiencing the divinity of who we are and becoming the Christ. Even he makes it clear, I did not come to save you. I came to remind you of who you are.
Yes,
that is so beautiful.
Yeah.
And it's so strange anyway when we think about it. How could we ever have thought somebody else could save us? Physically, they could, but spiritually, how could they do it?
Really makes sense when you think about it. It's really strange. But
Yeah.
they got away with it, the church fathers.
Oh, they did, but they got away with it through terrible violence.
I know.
I mean, terrible, almost unrealizable violence. It's just, that was one thing, and I knew that, but when I started doing the studies and seeing it, it was almost beyond what I could think that would happen. And still they had the power, but that's how they suppressed and repressed this ancient tradition of who we are and knowledge of who we are, and really prepared us for totalitarian regimes and dictators. You know, if we are always thinking to go outside ourselves and follow someone, it's always the power is out there, then of course we are vulnerable to that in the physical political world, it seems to me.
Yeah, perhaps we should point out, well, a couple of things here. You were talking about the feminine and the masculine. That has nothing to do with gender, really, because it's all in us,
yes,
all.
Everybody, that's who we are.
That's one thing. And another thing is that a shaman is not a priest, because I mean, you were talking now about this following. A priest is someone you follow, but a shaman is just, how would you describe a shaman in this context?
Well, if he's, there are a lot of shamans that one wouldn't want to be around, but a true shaman is one who knows how to trigger within himself and within the community altered states of consciousness. In other words, he can, through ritual, he can trigger our ability to release that valve that restricts us for everyday life and experience cosmic consciousness. And that can be done. Now, the San people, it's through dancing and music and drumming. But dancing, I mean, they can dance for hours and hours, and then they describe it as this boiling up of energy until it comes off the top of your head. Well, that's one description. But shamans would really, the dance, repetitive movements and repetitive sounds, we know is one of the triggers. And so also there were sacred plants that shamans and people became very intelligent in their use and combination of them for thousands and thousands of years. And so many cultures use the plants. But even in the ritual of the movement and the chanting, we now know that a slow, integrative movement begins in the brain that flows through the brain and connects the brain components. So they were onto something, you know.
Yes.
But I think that it's sad to me that I've met people who are interested in shamanism and have gone to various places to work with shamans, but it's, oh no, I would never use sacred medicine. I'll do it on my own. But I think, what do we ever do on our own? You know, I mean, of course we have to have food from the earth. And that's what the Earth Mother was like. It's that giving of the earth, and we take it. It's a communal thing. There's all of this business of living and loving and being born and dying. And this fruit, the tree, before the Deuteronomist, was always the god and the goddess together were there pointing to the sacred fruit, as, you know, with their hands out, take it. It is here for you. And then in Egypt later, I just love the images of the tree. The trunk is actually the feminine, which would be the life force. Life itself is giving, sometimes it's a glass, a liquid of something to drink, or fruit. And very often the masculine is symbolized as all of us in time and space. The feminine is that eternal, being born and dying and being reborn. It's life itself, and we are experiencing life. So, but she's always giving. And some of the trees are sacred medicine. That's some of the trees that were sacred to her. So I think that's another misunderstanding that we have of somehow wanting to do it alone. People can. And in India, they used medicine for a while, and then many of them now, it's long-term meditation. But I think that we're in an age in which we are going to find many ways of triggering, opening that valve, and experiencing who we are, because we must if we want to survive. We can't repress and suppress it any longer.
Yeah, the use of ayahuasca and DMT and psilocybin and all those substances is increasing fast now, and maybe in some cases it's not used properly, but still there is an interest and there is a longing, as you say.
Yes, a deep longing. And during the 60s, I was teaching during that time, and certainly people didn't know how to use this, and they didn't have the background or the understanding, but they crashed into another world.
Yeah.
Some actually, I had a student of the father of a young man who had stepped off the roof of a building up at Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, with LSD. So many people were very against it because it could be dangerous without knowing where to be, what to do, and that kind of thing. But I think, some of our mathematicians and scientists had those experiences.
Yes, they have used it.
And that really developed a mathematics and a quantum understanding.
Yeah, and maybe that's why we need shamans even today. I mean, the shaman is more like a teacher, I understand, while a priest is like a father figure or someone you have to follow. But a shaman is not that.
Not to follow. It's that he can trigger it. And eventually we should all be shamans.
Yes.
All of us should be.
So to fast forward a little bit more here, we come to you talk in the book about, I think, 5 waves of Renaissance, some kinds of varieties of Renaissance. Of course, there's one wave that is actually called the Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance, but there were more. The first one that you write at length about is the High Middle Ages. And I found that really fascinating. There were so many cathedrals built at that time, and they were built in a way that they weren't actually sanctioned by the official harsh mandated religion, because they were built in a way that they were to revere the individual connection to God and also the feminine principle. And you write a lot about Chartres, the cathedral in Chartres, and I really want to go there, actually. Can you tell us a little bit about the High Middle Ages and the significance of what happened then?
Well, I was surprised myself, because I thought, well, that's Christianity.
Yeah,
and
same, I thought.
Yeah, same. But that, I think, was the truly profound awakening after the suppression by the Roman Church in the latter part of the 4th century, in the late 300s. That was a real suppression came when it was formed as the Roman Church, the only church. And then the murder and the destruction of all other traditions took place. So it was about 700 years of this just incredible suppression. And about 1000 AD, something began to emerge. And I think a lot of it had to do also with the Sufi tradition and the Arab sort of takeover. But Arabic culture at that time, many Christians fled to Baghdad and then to Persia, because men and women were equal. They were working and doing research together. I mean, it was just a profound renaissance in that culture, and also all the way up into Spain. So Cordova had powerful influence. People throughout Europe would go. Europe was undeveloped. We learned so much from the Islamic culture. And so that helped to make this possible. And I think that there was such a longing for something more than what the church was giving. And the church had become quite corrupt too, but there wasn't that individual experience. So at Chartres, it so happened that there were, and I didn't know this until I did the research, that there were teachers there who really understood the hidden tradition that Jesus taught. And that's what they worked with. And there were streams of this hidden tradition that Jesus taught coming throughout Europe. There was Paul and Dionysius, Areopagite, who was in Athens, and he talks about this person who came, Paul, who came and was like on fire with spirit. So the Paul that I knew was not like that, but the Paul that Dionysius knew, he just was absolutely taken with it. And he had been initiated in other mystery schools, and he saw this Christianity, this hidden tradition that Jesus taught, as that way to open to cosmic consciousness. And so his teachings, well, he was to teach in Athens in Europe, and Paul went through the Mediterranean. But his teachings went into France. They're called the pseudo Dionysus. It wasn't pseudo, they were just the ones who copied exactly what he had taught and kept it going. And that somehow got to Chartres and these teachers. But through other ways too, they actually taught the hidden tradition. And they also were very intellectual. They taught from the conceptual mind, I would say. They really nurtured the conceptual mind, very brilliant in that way. And their writings are brilliant, but they also nurtured the symbolic mind, the spiritual side, and the heart. And so some really incredible things happened at Chartres. And then, of course, they built the cathedral there. Now, who's the they? They were just called the builders. But we hear that these builders were initiates of life and death, birth and death mysteries of Egypt. Now, Egypt, it had at its core in the earlier phases, those people who really were shaman, mystic, scientists. That was another amazing thing that I learned with this, that depth of their understanding of the masculine and the feminine, and that beautiful relationship of opening and loving and desiring. It was not like later, all these no's and don'ts and evils. No, it was loving life and desiring it and living it fully, the male and female together. So, but I think that they also had science too. They understood the science. So that was there, but it was lost. The Egyptians were very crucial to the Greeks, but the Greeks never really quite understood the depths, I think, of the Egyptians. So it's all there, but then when it comes into Chartres, we have these builders that we are told were initiated people from Egypt. That was that, and I think it was probably even deeper than that. And somehow these builders were all over the earth. This is a mystery I don't understand.
It is a mystery, but it's fascinating. And they built those churches in fairly brief amount of time compared to how it was normally built.
Absolutely. And the knowledge, architectural knowledge that they had, and also the stained glass. I'm told that after that was done, those cathedrals were finished, that no one could find anyone who could do the stained glass. Also, there were those sufis too, who had a very deep understanding of spirituality and knowledge in the physical world. They were brought, because of the Crusades, to France. They may have helped certainly with these, but the tradition was that the temple was always not just a place, an architectural structure. It was structured in a way to trigger our knowledge of who we are, a kind of to vibrate. And we're also told that all of those churches in France to Our Lady were built on the ground to in the same pattern of Virgo, Our Lady in the sky. This would not have been strange, because Egypt always felt what was in the heavens should be on the earth. So that, again, sort of linked to the Egyptian builders. But yes, it was just that one should be able to go into a temple. Like in Egypt, every temple was supposedly constructed to attract certain energies of the cosmos. And we are told that each temple is different, and each altogether, they are the complete sacred science, which the Egyptians knew. I don't know. And some people really believe they are our key to understanding this depth of who we are and our relationship to the cosmos. So much has been destroyed, and the Egyptologists had no idea
No.
about the inner. But there are those who did and who are working on it. Schwander de Lubitz was important, and I think Jeremy Nadler saw that the pyramid texts were shamanic texts, and Alison Roberts has also seen the depths of these rituals. So I think we're moving in the direction of truly finding that key to that culture. But I think this somehow, all of this was finding its way into France and at the time of the High Middle Ages. And then, of course, came it was depicted in the cathedrals, but it was also then depicted in story of the Parsifal and the Grail.
Holy Grail, yeah.
Yeah, and here it was after 700 years, such a longing for that Grail, for that gnosis of knowing oneself.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And talking about Egypt and the connection with Egypt here, you know, of course, also the theories that the pyramids are actually a lot older than is officially recognized.
Yes, and the Sphinx, and
yes, so that knowledge may have come from far back.
I think we have a lot to learn yet about that.
We have a lot to learn about that. Yes, it's fascinating. So then there were more waves. You talk about the Rosicrucian Renaissance, and the Italian Renaissance was in the 1400s, and then there was the Rosicrucian. We don't need to go very deeply into that, but that was in the 1600s, and then there was another wave in the late 18th century and the 19th century, of course, which is called the Romantic era, I think. Germany and England.
Yes. It was, first of all, this awakening after 700 years in the High Middle Ages, and then not long after that, really, was Italy. But and there was such a desire to develop, to go like Pico della Mirandola was such an incredible young person. I mean, he saw this tradition in the underground traditions of alchemy and Kabbalah, and he wanted so much to bring that together. In fact, he had a plan to bring all of the people all over Europe together to Rome, and each one of them talk about their tradition and see that at the heart they were all the same. He was this young, certainly not very diplomatic person who went to Rome to have that printed so that everybody could come. And of course, this is the way to do it, to have them come to talk, because he felt so much we'd find that at the heart they were the same. Well, of course, Rome, the church, when they got wind of what he was doing, they wouldn't let it be printed, and they canceled the conference and put him in prison. So it was so hard for this tradition to really be continued from the High Middle Ages, but it did, and it really fed into the later one at 1600, the Rosicrucian. And just one thing about that that's so important is that when that was destroyed by the church again, and the Habsburgs, church and state, they were scientists. And many times, wherever the shamans could be allowed to develop, they became scientists, of course, because that's just a conceptual way of understanding what we've experienced spiritually. And so that was suppressed. Their texts were destroyed. And then there was a 30 years war between the Protestants and Catholics. And then when science could actually develop again, it was in England, in the Royal Society for the Study of Science. But nobody could study consciousness. Nobody could even mention the inner world. And that's how the Western worldview developed.
I mean, counterintuitively enough, it was the Roman Catholic Church that determined the development of materialistic science.
Exactly.
Telling us about. So explain how that happened.
Well, it just happened that these scientists, and some of them had been a part of this shamanic scientific movement in the 1600s, because there was quite a bit of traffic between England and Heidelberg and Prague. It was just an explosion of knowledge and engineers coming together, and books and booksellers who were all part of this wonderful movement. Mathematics, they were the ones who gave mathematics to us. And so it was just a very creative period of time. And they were struggling with understanding nature mathematically and spiritually and so on. But when they tried to gain some power in Prague, which was somewhat legitimate because Protestants and Catholics could be very suppressive and repressive, but the Protestants always allowed more freedom. Rudolf in Prague was Catholic, but he allowed alchemists and hermetists and sufis. Everybody was there practically, in Prague. So they knew when he died that there would be another Catholic and they wouldn't be able to pursue these studies. So they tried to put in Heidelberg, the Prince of Heidelberg, and his wife, and they did, because they were wanted to a great degree in Prague, but they're called the Winter King and Queen, because once that happened, the church moved in on them with the Habsburgs, destroyed everything. I mean, it was, even Heidelberg was destroyed. It was a beautiful Renaissance city, you might say. And so here were these scientists who, they all wanted a renaissance for the world, and enlightenment. This was the true beginnings of the Enlightenment, is that we would be able to know who we are, to know how to go inward, and then to understand it intellectually and mathematically. And they would have an educational system. They would help the whole world to see this. Well, no, they weren't. And that was destroyed. And so many of them sort of tucked tail and went back to their home countries and were part of this Royal Society, but they couldn't really say who they were or what they'd been involved in. So there were those who knew. It's always, as you said in the beginning, that underground. So all of this knowledge had to go underground, as the alchemist or the hermeticist or
cathars.
And of course the cathars. There's another one. They kept that tradition. That was about 1200 when they were destroyed. But the cathars in southern France, of course, it was a beautiful area, prosperous, and the cathars. So many things have been said about them that I think are not true. I think only now we're really beginning to see beyond what the Inquisition had said about them. But there again, I mean, they certainly upheld that inner tradition, and they were just destroyed, thousands and thousands of them, and that. But it's interesting. It seems to me, and research is being done on that they did continue throughout Europe, and they were printers and paper makers. And in the bookmarks, we can see their symbols survived through those bookmarks in the paper. So that I think we're going to learn a lot more about them in coming years.
Alchemy, maybe you mentioned alchemy a couple of times here, and I think for ordinary people, it's about making gold out of lead or something, but it has nothing to do with that.
Yes, it's really yes. The lead is ourselves before we know who we are, and so it's a symbol of then to create the gold is to create the light in ourselves of consciousness of who we are. But the alchemists probably are rooted in the ancient Egyptian mysteries of death and rebirth, and as that began to wane, these people who knew these mysteries were alchemists, and many of them went down they were in Alexandria, and then there were others, the pre-Socratic philosophers in Greece, 500 years before Christ, and they also had a powerful, shamanic, a scientific, inventive, diplomatic tradition. And who is the person who's done so much with that? Peter Kingsley. His work, when I saw his work, I was so excited about it, that he actually saw, because when I was studying that, nobody said anything about shamanic culture, but he has retranslated from Parmenides, and very convincing work. So here was this tradition still alive after Christianity was trying to get rid of anything that wasn't its own. So they were moving over into Alexandria, and then they all had to go down to Alchemy. So the alchemists were there too. There were Greeks, there were Arabs, there were all sorts of people who were working in this underground tradition. Finally, they had to go over to Baghdad because the Christians were pursuing them, so they couldn't really exist. So here were the alchemists also working on how do we trigger that valve within us so that we can experience who we are, this cosmic consciousness. We are, our heritage is to live in connection with this, not in denial or ignorance of it. And so they then went on to Persia, joined with the Sufis, and during the Crusades, they came back to France. And I think that's also how that Renaissance, powerful Renaissance, began.
Yes, that's interesting. Ironically enough, they came back with some deeper knowledge
Yes.
about what Christianity should be about.
Yes, and of course it was all from different traditions. You know, Carl Jung said that that always underneath the surface, which was Christianity, was that underlying alchemical tradition of, I think he said 1200 years, 14, I don't know, but actually it was far longer than Christianity. And he saw it as that tradition that actually complemented Christianity. Christianity had done away with the feminine and the wisdom teachings, and alchemy maintained it. Because, of course, for us to be whole, we have to experience all of that, the masculine, the feminine, the light, the dark, the whatever, is that wholeness. In fact, Vico, Giambattista Vico in Italy, at the same time as the Enlightenment philosophers in France, he was writing about wholeness, about the symbolic mind. He knew that it was developed, it evolved earlier than the conceptual mind. And he knew very well that if we want to experience our wholeness, we have to allow both the symbolic mind and the conceptual mind. As he put it, there must, in order to experience our wholeness, there must be a dynamic and integral continuum of movement between the symbol and the idea, always, always. That's our wholeness. And we can now say it has to flow through the heart, because that is our central brain that connects us to other dimensions. But the French philosophers, it was, no, that's all nonsense, anything that came before. Only the rational mind is important, and we have achieved the apex of that. And so it was a very arrogant, as Western intellectualism tends to be, because they only, I mean, if we think about it, we are a culture that really only valued and developed the rational, conceptual component, which cannot exist without the symbolic. And we forgot all about the heart until recently as being a brain component. It gives more to the mind or brain than the brain gives to it. So
new discoveries are coming.
Yeah, we have rediscovered it.
But you you emphasize a lot in the book and in other contexts what you're talking about right now here, that the Western culture, the Western world has rejected the shaman mystic traditions and the knowledge, the insight that each and every individual can attain higher dimensions and reach God, if you will. But what about the other cultures of the world? I mean, the Chinese, the Indians, Southeast Asia, the Arabic culture. Have they been so much more tolerant towards this ancient knowledge? Or, I mean, is it only the Western world that has rejected this so totally?
Well, and I haven't studied that as I have the West, but I do know that certainly the Sufis are very ancient, and they were attached to Islam. They're very different sometimes from what we hear of Islam, but Islam itself is quite different from what we hear. But the Sufis are very ancient tradition, but they had trouble too in Persia too. They were persecuted later. And I think that in India, that was probably a very ancient tradition that survived. We're told that very ancient depictions of highly developed states of yoga were depicted, were around. So long before we thought some of the latest stages of understanding. So I don't know about that. That's not, and China certainly had with Taoism, and they had that, but there tended to be from those who didn't understand what was being talked about. That
I was just thinking about. I mean, if you look at the leaders, the leadership, the top-down rule in all these parts of the world, it looks more or less the same. It's been violence, and there's been slavery, and there's been all kinds of bad things happening. So I was just I'm not defending the West, but I was thinking maybe it's a little bit unfair to only depict the West as the sole culprit here.
Yeah, well, it was the only culprit I was going to study.
Yes.
It was about Western culture,
Yeah, I understand.
and certainly the other cultures had traditions, and we didn't even know we had a spiritual tradition.
No, that's the interesting thing, that you have dug up all this knowledge about that we actually had these traditions.
that we not to look always to the east. We have it ourselves, and we need to understand that. But no, I think that one can get discouraged when we look around the world and see that what is this with power and leadership that tends to make us neurotic and pathological. How do we have a culture? I think the whole world has to ask this question. How do we have a culture in which all of our technology, all of our knowledge is for the growth and development of the human being, life nurturing for the whole planet, for animal life, plants? How do we, Maria Gimbutas talks beautifully about that with old Europe. She said any technology they had was always used to enhance life itself. That was the most natural thing, is that you wouldn't create things that could cause harm to the human being. And somehow we lost that. I mean, our technology today has left us out of the equation very often.
Yeah, well, I think we lost the general sense of being close to nature or close to our souls. We lost a long time ago, but then you can talk about today's technology and today's way of living and all that. Hopefully I will get back to that a little bit later. But you mentioned, before, this has to do with what you're talking about right now, that World War II was a shock to you when you were just a small child, and you couldn't really understand what was happening. It was the grown-ups that were fighting, which was totally incomprehensible to you. So you were always, I guess, a seeker, and I understand the true transformation came when you experienced the deaths of your mother's son Pishti and your husband Istvan, and you and Istvan, you immediately came in contact with Pishti's consciousness, as far as I understand.
Yes, I would say that I was looking for this all my life. And when I taught myth and symbol to students during the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, it was always a searching. And they and I, we were together in this search. We saw, here are these symbolic structures, for instance, in fairy tales. It's very clear, they're a structure of the psyche. And we certainly discovered that, a sacred text or an authentic text is only that text which is organized by the organizing principles of the human psyche. It's not something we make up out of the conceptual mind. It really emerges out of those principles which are like the laws of nature we live by. These are the principles. They reveal themselves to us in these stories or in architecture or in music or in paintings. And we know when one is authentic because it's life-giving and life-supporting. And that's why if we read in the Deuteronomist version of the tree of life, it's totally inverted. It's that you should not eat this. You may not eat it. It's a sin to eat it. And if you do, you'll discover that you die. Whereas really you discover that you're immortal and divine and creative. So and their punishment and shame and exile. This is, of course, not a true myth. This is an inversion. And it's so important to know that. And so I worked with that for many years, and it was really a wonderful time that we had, and the students were so involved in it too. And then I thought, when I finished my doctorate, I thought, I really had it with the rational mind. I'm just going to go to South America and study with shamans and see what I can find out. And I did that twice, and I did experience another way of being in the world. I think it would helped me, but I did start having experiences, and I also then worked with sacred medicine, and that in itself was so powerful. I mean, things really began to change, and then. My mother was killed in an automobile accident. And then 1 year later, in fact, they took him off the life support. Strangely, it wasn't my doing, exactly the day and exactly the hour that my mother had been killed 1 year before. So that was a synchronistic. There were many synchronistic events that happened. And it was then my husband was killed in Hungary on a trip 2 years later. But in those 2 years, right after our son's death, we had very powerful experiences with Pishti. Some were spontaneous experiences. I think something with his death opened that in a way, which does sometimes happen. But we also use sacred medicine. But many were spontaneous. And my husband was one who had not been interested in this before. He respected my interest, but it wasn't his. But 2 weeks before our son was killed, he had a vision in his office, and he saw Pishti's car on the side of the freeway and Pishti's body superimposed on the top. And then he said to himself, I knew he was dead because it was 2 different dimensions. And then I said, oh, that's right, Pishti. It's almost time for you to do this. And that was such a shock to him. And then Pishti said, that's right, Dad. I'll be out of the house for a little while. Well, and then he became totally unconscious of it until the call came through that he was in the trauma center. But Ishwan didn't mention it to me until after his death. But he said, I tried to hope that he could, but that vision was so powerful that I felt that he would die. But he said the interesting thing is that he felt we knew this. We knew this. And of course, after Pishti's memorial, then we did start experiencing his consciousness. And in such a powerful, loving, joyful way, and could see that he was creating on the other side, and that many on the other side were very concerned about the earth, and they were working with us here in the earth. And I had my first vision after he died was of a spiral of people spiraling down to be born on the earth. And it was like Native American chanting. And of course, they have tried to keep the vision of this, indigenous peoples, but they were chanting, and I knew what they were chanting. And they were saying, our brothers and sisters on the earth are dreaming a terrible dream.
Yeah.
And that they wanted to come to help us to wake up to see
help us. Yeah.
And so we had many visions with him. And not only did he want us to know he's okay, that there's no death, but also this is a project that we were working on, and that people all over the earth are working on it. They're not going to get in the 6 o'clock news, but that there's so many of us. We're connected in a way we've never been connected before. And we know we're working together. And what was beautiful was to realize that we're working with intelligence and consciousness on the other side. That's what we should know. That's our heritage, to work consciously with that other side.
Do you believe we choose our preconditions in life before we are born to learn?
You know, that's such a question that I don't know how to answer, because when I can think of so many situations and people who would say, I didn't choose mine, but I don't know. All I know is that it seemed to us both that we knew that this was going to take, this was, of course, you can't determine everything because we're co-creating with other people, but that...
yeah, that's why I said preconditions and not choose the whole life.
Yeah, good. Yeah. But I think so. And it's as though we do come with some notion of our creativity, and then we learn how to bring about that creativity in matter by co-creating with others, and then remembering. I think this is a pretty difficult job to come into the earth at this point. You know, when it's it's to get in touch with it. I mean, there's nothing there, and then you find, oh, there is something. But thank God we have quantum physics, you know, that supports us. We cannot in the West do anything without support of science. We just have to have that as our anchor. and we do. And so, and going back to other cultures, I think too, one thing that happened is that the West became so powerful and controlling that it did influence the rest of the world as well. Certainly they had their darkness within themselves and within their own cultures. But I think that today we have to see that America and Europe, we've had a very powerful influence on the world.
No, that's true. That's very true. So maybe that's why it's relevant to pinpoint, to emphasize the West's activities in this respect. Talking about quantum physics, what significance do you attribute to the recent discoveries of quantum physics and also the connection between brain, heart, and mind, and also, I mean, the increasing number of near-death experiences, because it has become easier to resuscitate people with cardiac arrest. What significance does this have for our possible awakening, if you will?
It's like all of these things are synchronistically happening, and so many began to happen in the 20th century. If I look around and feel a little bit thrown off or depressed about all the darkness or the violence, and there is tremendous violence, I have to remember, wait a minute, think about this. In the 20th century, we discovered these cultures. We discovered our own roots in the West in a deep spiritual potential. And we also discovered quantum physics. And near the end of the 20th century, it became clear that there are other dimensions of reality, and that what is once connected is not separated, and that consciousness does continue. And it's so interesting to me that mystics describe the spirit world in the very similar way as scientists describe the quantum field.
Yeah.
You know, it just, I think when I first started teaching, I used to, in teaching composition, there would always be a section on, we can never bring science and religion together. And here I am, still alive, and we are bringing spirituality and science. Of course, they have always been together. Yes. I mean, to experience...
We just forgot it.
And it was suppressed so that we couldn't remember it. You know, when you think about how people who haven't experienced it, for instance, in the Roman Church, there were heretics, anyone who talked about experiencing that within. It was out, the Gnostics were the most dangerous people, but of course, because they wouldn't have had power. If we all experienced that ourselves, it would have been a whole different thing, as in the mystery schools.
There wouldn't be any need for bishops or priests or popes or any of the kind.
Well, you know, Richard Maurice Bach, who wrote Cosmic Consciousness, when he said that, you know, he was spending an evening with people, they were talking about poetry and various poets, and they were reading them, and he was going home in the carriage, and he thought at first the city in front of him was on fire, and then he realized it was within him. And he had this spontaneous experience of cosmic consciousness, and he gave it that name. And he said, I don't know how long I was there, but he said, I knew in that moment, I knew we are all one, and we are all born out of love and consciousness, and that there is no death. And that we are all moving toward this understanding, this living in cosmic consciousness, just as we move from the animal state to an ego consciousness state, self-aware state. We are moving to a place where we will all have this cosmic consciousness, and we will be able to work with that. We will create out of that consciousness in the material world, be deeply connected.
Here's a question that is perhaps a little bit strange or stupid or something, I don't know. But I mean, the fact, if you're convinced that we don't die when the body dies, we belong somewhere else, so to speak, does that make it easier to accept that there are problems on this earth, or does it make it more difficult? I mean, violence and lack of love.
You know, I think that violence and censorship, the stopping of any kind of growth and development, is always something to grieve. I think that,
but it's also an experience.
It is an experience. It is an experience of
not saying
how not to do it.
Want that experience, but it is an experience.
Well, it is. And, I've never been able to accept that statement that, well, God will never give you more than you can experience,
Yeah.
because there are people all over the world who can't possibly assimilate what's happening to them, and they're starving, and people. You're right. And that, again, I have no absolutes on that one or answers, but I think it is an experience. But I would like to think that as creators, we're learning how to create in matter, and our ancestors knew that we needed to create according to the laws of nature and our own nature. And if we go against those laws, we're going to hurt and we're going to cause pain to others. And if we go completely against them, we're going to be very violent. As Jesus said in the Nag Hammadi text, I love that statement when he said, if you bring forth what is within you, it will save you. But if you do not bring that forth, it will destroy you. And I kind of like to look at our creativity in that way. Let's bring that forth. And we have to work with the laws of nature and bringing it forth in our own creative, individual way. And if we cause harm, we can see, yes, that's an experience. I don't want to do it that way again. I mean, I think if, we are reincarnated, we've done some bad things, I'm sure, throughout our lives. And hopefully in my past, I hope I learned, I don't want to do that again. Let me do it a different way. Let me do it in a way that there can be such joy and love and experience, in life.
Yeah, I agree. But in the book Merchants of Light and in other contexts, you paint a pretty grim picture of the world right now, especially at the beginning of that book. And in my view, I have a fairly different view on what the world looks like right now, actually, because I actually wrote a book that was all about that the world is better than we think. So my thinking is that, I think the world has never been better than it is today. My thinking is that if we had been completely cut off from spiritual truths, love, compassion, respect, we would not have been here today with human rights, less bloody wars, which they are actually, but few people know that, less poverty, and actually also improved stewardship of nature, because we didn't take care of nature 100 years ago, 200 years ago, the way we do today. So maybe the sense that many have that it's worse than ever comes from the fact, or it's an expression of the fact that we see our shortcomings and missteps more clearly than ever. What do you think of that?
Well, my friend Kim, whom you just met, we're always saying when we're seeing a film of other times, oh, thank God we weren't born then.
Yes.
Thank God. And yes, there's so many things today, so many possibilities, and we see what we're doing wrong, in a sense that we don't want to do it that way. But and I think that I absolutely agree with you there. But I also think that, and I'll stick just to the West because I know that better. Other countries have to deal with theirs, or the East. But I think that, but the fact that this deep potential within us has been suppressed for power and control for so many years, so many centuries, that it has harmed so many people. And there's a deep neurosis or pathology and illness in many that can only think in terms of the future, in terms of control and power over, or, for example, all that technology is not as it was earlier, even in a lesser developed form. It's not focused on how to enhance what is human. If we're thinking in terms of artificial intelligence, are those people who are working with that aware of that true potential to experience the cosmos, to awaken the heart and all of the components of the brain? We are already more than they can give us.
Yeah.
I think artificial intelligence can enhance, but to enhance, you've got to know what is potential.
Exactly.
I see
every
some real
technology
dangers.
is neutral in itself. Every technology is neutral in itself, so you just have to develop it wisely, of course.
Yes, and if we want to fool around with the human being and the brain, we need to know something. We need to do the research on the mind when it functions in its wholeness and experiences other dimensions of reality. before we start bungling through with our notions of artificial intelligence. I mean, some of it can be highly enhancing, but we've got to know who we are first. And the research should be there, I think, and with our children, to help our children to know, to ways. Well, there's a school. Some person told me the other day. I can't even remember, but where children are taught, they're blindfolded and they're taught to see without seeing. They're taught to this deep intuitive sense of their presence, and it's amazing. I saw a film of them blindfolded and they could see who was there. Oh, and it's interesting. I think there's so many things that if we really wanted to do research on enhancing the human being, it would be to let's see what we can do with the abilities that are innate. We don't even know them really. Hopefully, like for instance, the San people, that they can be out in the desert and they'll hear this like a tapping at the heart, and they know that someone's trying to get through to them, and they pick it up. I mean, just think there's so much that we have, and I hope that it won't be destroyed, in our ignorance of our potential. But I agree with you. I think we have tremendous potential today. And I said that in the book, all of these things that we became aware of and we're bringing together. But at the same time, we did not bring forth what was within us. That's a very good sentence from Jesus from the Nag Hammadi text there. It should be written in every church, actually, instead of the things that are there now. Yes. Yeah. And that's dangerous for our whole culture. Yeah. I was just thinking that maybe this journey through the quote unquote spiritual wasteland that we have made has had a purpose. I mean, maybe humanity has in this way had the full experience of a three-dimensional reality, if you see what I mean, the hard way, as it were. So then there would have been some kind of it's difficult to understand that from this perspective, but from a higher perspective, maybe there was some kind of meaning to it. We can't say no to that. We have to be open to every possibility. Every possibility, yes. And God knows, and we know, that what we're learning through seeing this kind of suffering of children, how can some of these children in these places, they can never tap into their potential. And, I think that was really trying to be communicated to me. I had an experience in Death Valley, of all places. My husband and I went there after Pishti's death, and we worked with San Pedro, the sacred plant from Peru, South America. And it seemed that, I don't know, for some reason or other, they were kind of present for me. I don't know what happened, but I went so deep that I couldn't come back, you might say, in a sense. I realized it. But when I did come back, it was a voice that was screaming. I knew I was in grief for Pishti, but what I was experiencing was way beyond anything one individual could experience. It was like I felt this just moving through the desert and coming through my body and through my throat. And it was screaming, it can never be healed. And it was like that sense of all of the suffering. And there was that consciousness on the earth, I think, that it couldn't be healed. I think it can be harsh healed. If it can never be healed. Oh yeah, it is too hard. But I think that was the experience of, perhaps we could say, the Pachamama, the Earth Mother, to see all of this. And I felt throughout South America that she was there showing me, making me see some things of what our choices had brought. And yet I knew that it was beyond me, but I also knew that it was an experience. She was experiencing that. That was an experience that you could have on the earth when you saw the darkness. But also there was another powerful side of that archetype, and I look at it as an archetype now, is that loving return of the heart consciousness. And that was so powerful. My husband experienced this, and I did too. And I felt her return, and I knew I had taken that voice of the desert within me. And she came and entered me and embraced that desert woman. And I feel that's a bringing together of the two sides of an archetype. Yes, we have learned a lot, and maybe we needed to. And we learned that we came to a point that maybe it could never be healed. There's nothing. And yet there is that vast cosmic loving force that enters into us and embraces us and brings wholeness to that view.
Yeah, I mean, the world is integrating now for the first time in recorded history, which means that it's probably easier to reach a critical mass of people. And if we can merge spirituality with science, I think the scientific language will resonate with a lot of people, a lot of modern people, which makes it perhaps possible that we are entering a time, or the time is ripe for some kind of awakening.
I believe that. I absolutely think that. And it's beautiful, and I like that. And I think we are merging them because they belong together. They are together. It's just another language. And that
it's a false dichotomy,
Yes. And in the West, we need that language. I needed scientific language. And I mean, I'm not a scientist, but to the degree that I could use that language, it was so healing for me. So yes, I think that, and people all over the earth are having their own experiences, the near-death experiences, as you mentioned. And scientists know that's happening. Doctors know their patients are going through these things.
Yeah.
So yes, I think that we are at a time in which we are beginning to bring together our past and realize our potential at the same time that we've got to do business with what was not brought forth, the darkness that we have allowed to be in the world. But I think we can do it. I think we have that understanding and that potential that's growing.
Betty Kovach, it has been a true pleasure speaking with you today. Tell us where the listeners and the viewers can find your work and your books.
Well, they can get the books in any place where books and ebooks are sold, or they can get them at Kamlak, KAMLAK.com, Kamlak. And if you sign up for our newsletter, which tells more about what's going on, then you can also get a chapter sent to you from Merchants of Light. So, and there are many things on the website is kamlak.com. So
kamlak.com, yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So thank you.
Notice the inner ML, Merchants of Light. That came to me as a surprise. I did not know.
Okay.
Yes. So I think it's a name it was supposed to have.
I understand. Well, thank you so much, and good luck with your light work.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.